Francesco, do you want to start, please?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio. I'm the coordinator of CFAL York operations. I would like to officially open our first lecture of our Emerging and Systemic Risks monthly lecture series with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tekaronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our lecturer, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to this lecture series. For those who may not be familiar with CFAL York, our center was established in 2020 and started its operations in 2021. CFAL York was created in collaboration between the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and York University with York Region to develop and deliver training and knowledge sharing, as well as capacity building programs across 5 focus areas, which are disaster and emergency management, health and environment, entrepreneurship and economic development, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Ali Asghari.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have you all in the first session of our Emerging and Systemic Risk lecture series. It's going to be an ongoing series provided to you by a number of groups and research centers, including CFAL York, but primarily by York Emergency Mitigation, Engagement, Response, and Governance Institute. This is indeed the first public session organized jointly and primarily by Y-Emerge. We welcome you and hope to see you in all our future events. This is a monthly event, so starting with this one first, we are very pleased to have Dr. Jack Rozdilski with us today. Dr. Rozdilski is an associate professor of Disaster and Emergency Management Program at York University in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Rozdilski's professional duties include research, teaching, and service in topics related to disaster, social science, emergency management, and homeland security practice. Some of his research, recent research, includes study of 2018 Toronto one attack, and he's a co-investigator in a pandemic-related project that is sponsored by the Canadian Institute for Health Research, investigating COVID-19 relating with stigma. Some of his current research efforts, including exploring preparedness for nuclear war. Prior to joining the faculty at York University, Dr. Rozdilski was a university professor of emergency management in both Illinois and Texas, and he has also worked professionally as a hazard mitigation planning efforts. He holds a doctorate in research development and urban studies from Michigan State University, and we are very pleased at York University to have him as a colleague for a few years. And thank you very much, Jack. I know this is a field that you are passionate about, and we have been proud to have you in the program and be a colleague of you. And thank you. Without further ado, the floor is yours, and looking forward to your presentation.
Dr. Asghari and Mr. Del Caprio, thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm honored to be joining and providing some comments regarding the inaugural effort of this lecture series. For my presentation this afternoon, what I would like to do is, Mr. Del Carpio, I would like to attempt to share the screen to show my presentation, where I will have some words and pictures on the screen to augment my presentation, and I'll provide some narration. My comments on the topic will be for Dr. Asghari. I intend for my comments to be about 35 to 40 minutes, if that's okay. And then perhaps at the end, if there's time or interest, we could have other questions or comments related to the topic.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. You can share your slides if you.
Thank you. I will share slides on right now. So right now on the screen, you should see opening title slides shared. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you.
Thank you. The title of my presentation this afternoon is Preparedness for Nuclear Conflict, Reuse of Former Nuclear Bunkers in Canada. My presentation this afternoon will have 4 parts. I'll have some opening remarks to provide a context. I will then speak directly to a site that has been reused in Canada. That is the reuse of a former Cold War nuclear bunker site known as the Defen Bunker, which is now a museum. Then I have some remarks in conclusion to provide a summary and wrap up of this research effort in progress. First of all, for this emerging and systematic risk lecture, I want to start off with the opening point that in one sense, the topic I am speaking about this afternoon, nuclear conflict, is not an emerging risk. It's a risk that has existed since 1945. However, in winter of 2022, it can be suggested that this old risk that has been with us for decades is now newly reemerging again. That is due to factors such as the threats of nuclear weapons use related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is a situation that is bringing attention to the issues of preparedness for nuclear conflict. Regarding this risk in Canada, Canada does not possess nuclear weapons, although Canada is allied with nations that have large nuclear weapons arsenals. I also want to make the point that the risk of nuclear attack in Canada is very low when we consider the entire scope of risk coming from both natural causes and human-induced causes in Canada. If we look at the singular risk of nuclear attack, it can be considered in the category of risk that have a very low probability, but should the risk be realized, the risk will have a high consequence. For Canada, nuclear attack preparedness is sometimes considered as a relic of the Cold War past, or something that we look at from a historical perspective rather than a present day preparedness issue. Be that as it may, I am suggesting that in 2022, the risk of a nuclear attack impacting Canada is low, but at the same time, greater than 0. I also suggest that we ignore this risk at our own peril. Even though it is a very, very low risk, I suggest it's not, right now in 2022, this is not a risk that we should be ignoring or not speaking about at all. Thus, some of the research I'm doing to attempt to bring these issues to light. A starting point for nuclear attack preparedness in the 21st century starts with reflecting on our own civil defense heritage. Much of that comes from activities that have taken place in the mid-20th century. regarding specifically this research topic I'm presenting on, there are only a few Cold War era nuclear bunkers remaining in Canada today. One of those bunkers, which will be highlighted in this presentation, is a large underground complex located near the capital of city of Canada, Ottawa. That complex is known as the Defen Bunker. It once served purposes related to preparedness for nuclear conflict, and the nuclear bunker is now currently in use as a Cold War museum. And I would highly recommend for any of you who may be interested in this topic, perhaps the next time you're in the Ottawa metropolitan area, perhaps you might want to take an afternoon visit to the Defen Bunker Cold War Museum to actually see this topic we're talking about today in real life. My conclusion of my opening remarks that this is a presentation of findings of a qualitative research project that is currently in progress. I would also like to acknowledge a York University Disaster and Emergency Management Master's Degree candidate, Kristen Fazy-Kanan, whose research includes looking at aspects of the Defen Bunker. In this presentation, I will provide a brief Cold War context for the Defen Bunker for reference, and I'm also at the end going to make a short reference to nuclear bunkers in Central Europe. Part 2 of the presentation concerns the site reference that has been a former Cold War nuclear bunker in Canada that has currently been put into reuse as a museum, the Defen Bunker. The context for the Defen Bunker is Canada is geographically located between what was formerly the Soviet Union and the United States. So in the event in the mid-20th century, there would have been a nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. It would be likely that portions of that nuclear attack would have come over Canadian airspace, putting Canada in the position of being threatened directly or indirectly by nuclear weapons. Even though Canada was not a nation that possessed nuclear weapons, and Canadian cities probably would not have been targeted, Canada would have still been at risk should have a nuclear war occurred in the past between the United States and Soviet Union. Those risks were taken seriously in the late 1950s and early 1960s by the government of Canada, specifically former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker provided direction and authorization for a project to create a bunker to house key representatives of the government of Canada in the event of nuclear war threats, and that bunker became known as the Defen Bunker, thus that name. In 1959, construction began building the Defen Bunker, and the bunker structure was completed by 1962. The concept for the bunker is represented in this cartoon diagram, but essentially it was a large underground complex that had design elements that would protect persons inhabiting the bunker from effects of nuclear war, such as initial nuclear blast and fallout. In addition, the bunker would be able to preserve a life-sustaining environment for representatives of the government of Canada to reconstitute some sort of government and then reemerge after the nuclear war to take actions for Canada to survive in the future past those events. From 1959 to 1994, the Diefenbunker was owned and operated by the Government of Canada through the Department of National Defense. As indicated, it was a massive 4-story underground complex that was built for continuity of government purposes in the event atomic bombs were to have fallen over Canada, or if in the event the center of Canada's government, Ottawa, would have been targeted. The bunker was decommissioned in the mid-1990s, but curiously enough, this bunker did not go into disuse, dereliction, or abandonment. The bunker was reopened to the public in 1998 as a Cold War museum. Part 3 of my remarks concern reuse of the Diefenbunker as a museum. I want to provide a brief research note. I'm going to next show a few pictures from the Diefenbunker to highlight what I am talking about. But I want to indicate that these pictures are only a small part of a larger data set that's classified as part of data for a qualitative field research project, where I'm using methods of participant observation. The theoretical context for this work is grounded in subjects of dark tourism being the subset of atomic tourism, and something that's called the field of bunkerology. I'd like to briefly depict a few of the theoretical groundings of this work for reference. Dark tourism is defined as a type of tourism that tends to be used as an umbrella term for any form of tourism that in one way or another is related to death, suffering, atrocities, tragedies, or crimes, a concept that has its origin in the 20th century. A specific subset of dark tourism is atomic tourism, and in the last decade, the area of atomic tourism has grown in popularity. A part of that was due to certain circumstances prior to the current conflict in Eastern Europe, which allowed for tourism to sites of nuclear accidents, specifically the Chernobyl site. But if we look at atomic tourism, there is a heritage of a specific type of tourism where people would visit sites related to nuclear war, sites related to nuclear accidents, or different tourism sites related to heritage and military aspects of the Cold War. Another theoretical underpinning for this work is something that's called bunkerology, which was a phrase coined by Luke Bennett in 2011, where Dr. Bennett performs some studies of former bunkers in Great Britain and Europe, and in that process, he formed a field of thought concerning a theory and practice of urban exploration, specifically looking at nuclear bunkers and bunkers which were created for the purposes of defense. That brings us to looking at a few pictures of the Diefenbunker, and I present these pictures as an example of quantitative data, as an example of a qualitative data set where photographs were gathered as data for later analysis to attempt to code and determine themes that are represented for from the Diefenbunker concerning our past heritage of civil defense and emergency management, and also to give us clues and perhaps insights as to how we can better prepare in the future for potential civil defense related threats. What these two photographs indicate is what one would see on the surface at the Diefenbunker, where a majority of the site, the bunker complex, is underground for obvious reasons, and at the surface one would see very minimal surface features. Also, when one enters the Diefenbunker, one enters the Diefenbunker through various blast tunnels, and these blast tunnels were purposely engineered as entryways to ensure that people inside of the Diefenbunker would be able to survive, where the blast would be absorbed by certain elements of the building, allowing for the operational areas where Government of Canada workers would be employed to continue operation. These two photographs depict typical scenes one would see underground in the corridors of the Diefenbunker, where there were a maze of office-like corridors, and then off those corridors would be a number of offices where functionaries of the Canadian federal government would be continuing operations of the federal government during a nuclear war. Another point about the Diefenbunker, which at least I find very interesting from a disaster and emergency management perspective, one can directly see elements of the command and control methods that were established for the operational aspects of the Diefenbunker. And an important point to consider in the field of disaster and emergency management is that when one can look at the past and how these efforts were organized, we can draw direct lines from these past activities in civil defense to how current activities in disaster and emergency management are organized. So both from an educational and historical perspective, the Diefenbunker provides, I think, valuable insights for us to consider actual emergency management type strategies that could be used in events like nuclear attack. And yeah, one of the interesting museum-like aspects of the Diefenbunker that also deserves mentions is that when one would look at the Diefenbunker, you feel like you're immersing yourself into a past era, where very careful work has been done at the Diefenbunker for preservation of history, and including seeing computers that are the size of a room. You would see a picture of the young Queen Elizabeth as the former head of state for Canada. You'd also see things like ashtrays in offices, representing an era where it was common to be smoking cigarettes in government offices. When we see scenes like this, they give us insights to a past era, depicting situations, circumstances, and people, places, and things that don't exist currently in 2022. Yet this context of the past, I think, helps us to understand what was happening in the era, in the past eras, when the Diefenbunker was an important part of our continuity of government in Canada. At this point in time, I'd like to move to the conclusion of my presentation by highlighting a few points. And additional research I am looking at, which is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I would like to provide a short mention of this. There are many examples of Cold War era nuclear bunkers being reused for a variety of purposes outside of Canada. In Canada, we find very few examples of these reuses. In fact, we find very few, if any, examples of surviving Cold War era nuclear bunkers for either continuity of government or population protection purposes. But in a situation earlier this autumn, where I was fortunate to be able to spend some time in the Czech Republic, I looked into the situation of how Cold War era nuclear bunkers are potentially being reused in Central Europe. And I found examples of nuclear bunker sites being used for commercial tourism purposes. I also found examples of nuclear bunkers being used as places to stage escape room type live action games. Bunkers were also being used as locations for clubs and nightlife. There were some examples of bunkers being reused as museum venues, such as what Canada has done with the Diefenbunker. Also, there was some very creative work taking place where these underground bunkers would be used for sites of creative arts exhibitions, ranging from visual mediums to film making to performance art. Also, a more mundane reuse of these Cold War era nuclear bunkers was used for storage sites. When I was in Prague, I found that old Cold War era nuclear bunkers were also still used to this day for their original purposes. Those purposes being population protection during a nuclear attack. Visually, the bunkers appeared to be outdated. They appeared to be decaying. Some almost appeared to be old or abandoned. But in exploration of these bunkers, an important conclusion that I found was that government authorities in the city of Prague have a mission to preserve and maintain these bunkers for use in the present day. In other words, if there were some type of situation where citizens of the city of Prague would be threatened by some type of nuclear attack, there would be at this moment space for tens of thousands of people to seek shelter in various nuclear bunkers in Prague. One of the issues that's faced in a place like that is there are not enough bunkers to protect the population of the entire city of 1.3 million people. But the point I would like to make, at least in that circumstance, we see a situation where a portion of the general population would be able to seek shelter in case of a nuclear attack. And in many other places, including Canada, residents in cities do not necessarily have these options available to us. Back to Canada, my findings are indicating that in Canada, most Cold War era nuclear bunkers were long ago abandoned and no longer exist. There is one significant example of a Cold War bunker in Canada that has been reused, and that reuse has been as a museum, and that is the Defen bunker in Ottawa, which I highlighted in earlier portions of this presentation. But my research and my research and progress indicates that there are very few remaining Cold War nuclear bunkers existing in Canada, where most of them have went derelict and they've been abandoned, they're no longer used, and you can't even find them anymore. The only reference to many of these sites resides in historical documents going back to civil defense activities in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and 1970s. Another concluding point I would like to make is that at least for Canada, including the Defen bunker, that none of the remaining nuclear bunkers in Canada can be used for their original purpose of providing protection against nuclear attack. So when we consider this topic in the realm of emergency management, of preparedness for a disaster, which is the type of disaster, nuclear war, that would have a very, very low probability, but if in the event the risk was to be realized, would have a high impact. That raises the question to us in disaster and emergency management of what has happened to our past heritage of nuclear war preparedness in Canada. And it also raises the question, given the current global tensions, of if some type of nuclear conflict were to develop in the coming months or years, what type of preparedness efforts would we be able to engage in Canada if that threat were to be realized? So with those remarks, that is the conclusion of my formally prepared remarks for this presentation. I am going to stop sharing the screen at this point, and I will turn the floor back over to Dr. Asghari. And Dr. Asghari, I'd be pleased to engage in any questions or discussions if appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rozdilski, for this great presentation and talk. Everyone, please feel free to ask your questions either at the Q&A part, or if you are willing to speak on to your question, please raise your hand and we can open up your microphone for asking your question. To start with, perhaps I can start with some discussion or conversation. First of all, I want to also add to the chat that you had your own observations of your visit to Prague cases just published in Conversation, and I would like, if you permit me, to share the link with our audience so that they can.
Yes, I see it right now. Thank you very much, Dr. Asghari, for providing that link to a recent to some recent work, some recent thinking I've been doing on this topic.
Thank you so much. I mean, first of all, I hope that this of course never happens. All of us think so, and we have to work hard that this type of issues or risk never realized. But of course, as an emergency management, we should think about and work on it either as research and also professional preparedness. Based on what your observation on what you see, that's my question. Do you see any sort of attention from professional emergency managers looking into this at this point, or it is not something at their radar at this point? Based on your observation, I know this is not part of your research, but what you have been following up and so on.
Yes, Dr. Asghari, I'd like to respond with 3 comments. Comment number 1, I think as you very wisely alluded to, the solution to this problem is not having the nuclear war in the first place. And I would like to make that very clear, and as I guess an opinion I would hold. Not having nuclear war in the first place is the best solution to this problem. But I highly advocate civil defense in the present day. I highly advocate preparation for potential risk such as this, but at the same time, I think we have to have a deep realization that even ameliorating to a certain extent the types of risk the population would face by nuclear war from sheltering, in the end, the situation would still be horrible beyond what we would even consider imagining with nuclear war occurring. But that being said, I think in the field of disaster and emergency management, there has to be at least a few of us who consider this risk in the event this risk is potentially realized in the future. Now, being that this risk is a very, very low risk, I'm speaking from the city of Toronto. Given that at this given moment, nuclear war risk is low for Toronto, I also would suggest that that the risk is greater than 0. Dr. Asghari, one of the reasons I'm pleased to speak as a part of this series is that the series is concerning emerging and systematic risk. And I think from the disaster and emergency management perspective, I don't want to necessarily be critical here and suggest offhand that nothing is being done to consider this risk. That being said, I've seen mention of this risk in documentations from emergency management practitioners who think about issues related to nuclear threats. One of the more, I think, nuclear threats that's receiving more thought, at least in Ontario, is preparedness for the potential of an accidental release at one of Ontario's nuclear power generation facilities. I haven't seen too much tangible action applied specifically toward civil defense for nuclear war. Nothing to the extent that we have seen in the past eras of civil defense in the 1950s and 1960s. And perhaps that is justified given the relative risk of nuclear war versus other risks that we should be thinking about and preparing for from other human-induced or natural hazards. But I guess my only point here, my point is, I haven't seen too much preparedness or too much thought about this specific issue. In my opinion, I would suggest we need to be thinking about it more. And I also suggest that now during peacetime, I'm pleased that we could at least have these discussions and think about it and consider what risks are worth investing and preparing for. I'm suggesting some attention needs to be put to this hazard because when we get an emergency alert on our phones that the missiles are going to hit us in 22 minutes, that's not the time to start this thinking. The time to start this thinking is now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And great answer to my question. I appreciate that. And it actually ties with the next question. We have 3 questions coming up during this conversation now. The first 2 questions are from Yunus Imam. You know him by his work, and he's one of our great former students now working in the field. He's asking 2 questions. I read these questions. You can also read this, but I read for the purpose of future, probably those people who are listening or watching the recording. The first question is, what is the maintenance cost of these bunkers if they were to be maintained for their original purpose today? Have you any observation about that or not?
Yes, Mr. Imam, I can answer the question tentatively with respect to some of my findings from looking at this in Central Europe, specifically the city of Prague. The cost to maintain shelters for a portion of the population is a significant cost. Off the top of my head, I can't give the figure in Czech currency and quickly convert it to Canadian of what the cost would be. But I can say that in Prague, there have been controversies with some city government officials suggesting perhaps the funds being used to preserve nuclear bunkers in the state of preparedness could be better used for other purposes and administration of the city. The cost is not minimal, but I guess, again, we need to consider the cost versus benefit. How do we consider this risk of nuclear war? Is the risk real enough to us that any given society would find it worthwhile to put resources to maintaining that level of preparedness? And Dr. Asghari and Mr. Imam, I'd like to add one other brief comment. The brief comment is we don't necessarily need to think of nuclear war preparedness, specifically in relationship to the topic of bunkers, as just a singular activity for nuclear war. Perhaps a way that we can look at this as underground shelters can perhaps also serve other purposes which are relevant to disaster and emergency management. Perhaps protection and safe rooms, maybe for situations like severe weather, or even as secure sites to operate emergency operations centers from. So I think I would just suggest there is a cost, but when we consider the cost and benefits, I think through creativity, we could find ways to perhaps justify at least some cost and maintaining a level of preparedness.
Thank you very much. I think the next question is partially covered by your answer, but in any case, I'm reading it if you want to add any additional comments on that. And that is, many in public sector may see this or it as not an optimal use of funding, spending, of course, on this. How do you, or how do we justify it as something we need to? And as I said, this has been partially answered, but any additional comments? Well,
no, and I, if I may, I'd like to provide an additional a comment. Again, I think if we were to seriously consider the issue of providing bunkers for population protection in the event of nuclear war, the fact of the matter is, up to this point in history, we have two examples of nuclear war occurring in cities. That is August 6 and August 9, 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We do not have a long track record of this disaster occurring over and over again. Yet history sometimes repeats itself. I'm not professing that I have enough knowledge in geopolitics or political science to give a decent answer on if and when history may repeat itself. But at the same time, I can say that last week in the city of Kiev, Ukrainian authorities were preparing 425 sites for sheltering against nuclear war. Some of my observations from Central Europe have indicated, at least in some places, governments have made decisions to preserve Cold War infrastructure in a way that it is still working today. But then that question always comes up of cost versus benefits. One thing that I observed of at least of how Europe was treating this, it was not an entire solution to the cost versus benefit question, but instead of being abandoned, some of these bunker sites were being reused for things like commercial tourism related to communism tours, or things like nightclubs or music venues or arts spaces, where these spaces were being rented out for other uses. Then in the event that the sites needed to be used for their original purposes of population protection, and the rental contracts that were set up, at least in the city of Prague, the operators of the venues would realize they may be given short notice to close down, to move out, so the bunkers could be used for population protection. In addition, by renting out the bunker spaces for temporary uses at these unique sites, it could generate revenue to potentially offset the cost of upkeep and maintenance. Now, my research is not far enough along to make any substantial suggestions on exactly what the return on investment is for potential reuse of nuclear bunkers. But I think at least when we consider that issue, that's an option we can look at. But my last comment on this very quickly, in Canada, unfortunately, we do not even have the option in most places to consider reuse of the bunkers. End of
Great, thank
comment.
you very much. We have two more questions. The next question is coming from Carly Spencer. Thank you, Carly, for your question. And that reads as, I understand this seminar is based on pre-existing and previously dedicated bunkers, but are we aware of emergency managers dedicating non-bunker type buildings to such an event?
Carly, my answer to the question is I'm not aware, in the Greater Toronto area, I'm not aware of buildings that have been designated in that manner. That's not to suggest they do not exist anywhere in Canada, but I've been looking for that type of thing. And so far, the progress in my work is I have not been able to necessarily find a lot of evidence of that type of activity taking place at all.
Excellent, thank you. We are having more questions, so I'm going to go to next question from Robert Wilkinson. And that reads as, how does your research intersect with current research occurring with respect to new age bunker engineering, and how they could be designed or built as multi-use facilities? In example, asteroid collisions, electromagnetic pulse, or solar flare sites, etc., versus locating and renovating older facilities. Just before having your answer, I want to mention that our next talk on this series in a month from now would be on electromagnetic pulses and solar storms. Stay tuned for that. Going to your answer, Dr. Rozdilski.
My response to that question would be, in relation to this question, we're considering some of the, I think, more extreme existential hazard risk. I think the questioner has mentioned things like a near Earth object or meteor impacts, etc. Now, given current technology, given current knowledge of existential threats, if one were to go about building bunkers for existential Armageddon type threats in 2022, there would be a lot of new technologies that could potentially be employed that are not in the Cold War bunkers that were created in the 1950s and 1960s. Yet, I think the question comes back to, I've heard and read, and I think some of us have seen these things, anecdotal stories of people creating brand new bunkers for survival purposes, going along the lines of people who are interested in doomsday preparation. But at the same time, we we don't have too many concrete examples of these types of structures to study because of the great expense and because of the, I guess, low risk of these hazards. If we want to study these types of things, there's not a large study set of sites that we can look at to gain conclusions from. Therefore, audience and Dr. Asghari, I'm finding my work to be somewhat fruitful, at least looking at things that exist from the past, where we have a little bit, but at least a few things that I can begin to study and look at, and perhaps use those examples from the past to learn about how we can better engage in civil defense activities today.
Thank you so much. And I think there is a follow-up question to that, and which is interesting, the way I read it, and it reads as and should we or should these facilities be considered less of a singular country asset and more of a global humanity asset in terms of funding models? Sort of that's back to you for any answer, comments on this.
Yes, my response to that would be, in the previous question, I think a reference was made to meteor impacts or near Earth object impacts. When we look at preparation for those types of hazards, we see global organization for planetary defense of either sheltering or deflecting near Earth objects from impacting us in terms of meteor strikes. Now, what I find with nuclear war preparedness, given that we have 9 nuclear armed nations, nuclear war preparedness and civil defense, for better or worse, takes on, I think, more nationalistic overtones, where individual nations don't see themselves, unfortunately, as working together in times of nuclear war, but attempting to make arrangements to survive for themselves. Unfortunately, I think sometimes this topic lends more toward conflict than cooperation in terms of preparedness, which I think in the end is unfortunate for a number of reasons.
Thank you very much. We have Christian who rose his hand, and I want to open up his mic to speak. Go ahead, Christian.
Okay, hello. Thanks, Dr. Asghari. Thanks, Francesco, and also thank you, Dr. Rozdilski, for your presentation. Out of the many points you referenced, I do have a few questions. I think they've kind of been touched upon already, but the first one is many bunkers in the Czech Republic that was noted are able to shelter many thousands of persons, indicating a noticeable difference in preparedness levels for this particular disaster risk. What primary factors result in different preparedness levels between Canada and Central European bunkers, and that is Czech bunkers that you've seen? And I do have a second question. I can leave that for after.
Yes, Christian, thank you for the question. Dr. Asghari, looking at the time, we're approaching 1 o'clock, so I would like to provide a brief answer to the question. I think one factor that we see that's relevant if we're looking at a comparison between bunkers for population protection that exist in Europe and a lack of bunkers that exist for population protection in Canada is the 20th century history of the European continent, where there were numerous instances, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, etc., of active warfare taking place, of massive aerial bombardments of cities using conventional weapons, etc., where it's ingrained in the heritage of many European cities to in recent memory, people in living memory have recollections of the importance of bomb shelters, and that's notwithstanding the conflict, the war taking place today in Ukraine, and the immediate needs that we're seeing there concerning damage to civilian infrastructure and needs to shelter the population from the risk of active warfare. Dr. Zgari?
Thank you very much. We are almost reaching our time limit, but Christian, if you have a quick question to add, please, we may extend this to 1 more minute.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a perfect place to add the second question just after Dr. Rozdilski's points. I think right now what I'm wondering is, so my second question to follow up on that is when and how, without a very clear place to begin addressing this risk, specifically in the context of Canadian DEM, does more attention come to this risk in a broad sense in Canada?
My short answer to that question, I would suggest that from my observational experience of how disasters and crises are dealt with in disaster and emergency management, in terms of how society responds, usually after a disaster occurs, there is a lot of attention put toward those types of disaster risk, and then we begin to fully prepare for the last disaster. Yet at the same time, we are not preparing for future disasters. And I think, unfortunately, this subject matter may fall into that category where there's not a last disaster other than Hiroshima and Nagasaki to really be preparing for and responding to. And it's going to be difficult to gain attention for enhanced civil defense activities at the present time. But if in the very unfortunate event we do not want to happen, we see cities in the Western Hemisphere actually impacted by some type of nuclear conflict, I think there's going to be a lot of attention put toward then preparing for that last disaster. But unfortunately, that preparation will have been too late to work to protect and potentially save people who would have been impacted by that disaster. So in conclusion, I would just be suggesting at least now is the time for us to be having these discussions and to consider whether the risk of nuclear conflict is something that we should be preparing for to a greater extent than what we see our preparations for civil defense currently today. In other words, are we doing enough at present for civil defense, or do we need to revisit this topic and perhaps enhance our efforts within the scope of disaster and emergency management?
Thank you very much. Very fruitful answer and discussions. And we are almost 3 minutes after our time. However, I see questions and interest still on the topic, especially from Ira, who is the coordinator of Y Emerge, asking whether, for example, this current bunkers converted to museums can be again used for this purpose or reused. I think part of your investigation actually addresses this. If you want to comment on that, and with that, I'm going to just introduce our next topic and finish the session.
Okay. No, and Ira, in relation to that comment, very briefly, that's something I'm finding very interesting. And a previous questioner, Christian, is actually doing some research on this topic, but just when these former bunkers exist and we find them, they could either go into dereliction and abandonment and they disappear, or they could be reused. And in terms of the adaptive reuse of these sites, I'm taken aback just by seeing the types of creative uses that can be put toward these underground spaces. And in Central Europe, one of the uses that has, I think, been kind of popular regarding this is unique spaces for underground clubs, music venues, concerts, and nightlife, where I guess people would be seeking unique entertainment experiences, which are kind of augmented by the environment of being in an underground Cold War bunker. So there's a lot of, I think, creativity we can put toward adaptive reuse of these sites if we choose to take that direction.
Thank you very much. With this, we are going to end this session. However, I would like to briefly mention that our next session will be with Professor Afshin Rezai, who will be talking about solar storms. He's here. If you have anything to add, please welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Afshin Rezai, Associate Professor in the Electrical Engineering Department, Lausanne, York University. And the next presentation will be about solar storm and its effect on the society and technological systems. And all of you are welcome to attend. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. And this is also real. This is happening. We will cover that next month. Thank you all again for staying with us at this time. And thank you very much. I appreciate Dr. Rozdilski for a great presentation and starting this lecture series with this. I appreciate that, your time. We know everyone is busy at this time of the year, especially in academia, and that's really good to have you with us. And with that, I'm going to end. Thank you all for participating, and please share this news about this lecture series to your colleagues, friends, and network. See you next time, and thank you all, Francesco, Ira, and Dr. Zay.
Thank you, Dr. Askari and Rozdilski. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rozdilski. Thank you, everyone.